All right, get ready to dive in, everyone, because today we're setting sail for the Spanish Pacific. You know I love a good pirate story. And you were right, this book about 18th century Philippines, wow, talk about a new perspective on maritime power.
What's fascinating is how it reframes the whole narrative. We think Spanish Pacific, we think European dominance, right? But this book uncovers the incredible ways indigenous communities were shaping things on the seas.
Absolutely. It always seemed like an impossible place to rule. I mean, thousands of islands so far from Spain. But this colony lasted for centuries. And the book argues that to understand that, you have to understand the ever-present threat of piracy.
Yeah, and you have to understand that raiding wasn't something new, something outsiders brought in. The practice of mangaya, as they called it, was already a part of Filipino life long before the Spanish even showed up.
So it's not the Spanish introducing this, but rather stepping into a world where indigenous folks already had these practices of maritime power. That changes things, doesn't it?
Completely. And here's where it gets even wilder. The book talks about this huge surge in raiding throughout the 1700s, not just a continuation, but more frequent, more widespread, way more devastating.
So imagine the Spanish, used to imposing their rule, dropped into what felt like a constant water war. Their old tricks wouldn't cut it. What did they do?
They adapted, out of necessity, really. That's where we see these really surprising alliances forming and the creation of, well, you can only call them remarkable indigenous naval forces.
Okay, before we get into that, let's talk about that term, Moro pirates. The book uses it, but digs into how loaded that label was, right?
Totally. The Spanish, they still had this baggage from their history, the Reconquista, and basically lumped anyone involved in raiding as Moros, a way of saying they were like the Muslims back home, even if it wasn't accurate, almost projecting their own experiences onto a completely different context.
So this mix of like religious baggage and the very real threat of piracy in this new world they found themselves in.
And the economic side can't be ignored either. This was peak slave trade era, right? Fueling a lot of the raiding. Not just about religion, it was about profit too.
Wow, so much more complex than just Muslims versus Catholics then. Sounds like alliances were always in flux depending on who stood to gain.
You got it. Strategic thinking, religious motivations, economic opportunities, and just navigating those local power struggles. Survival at the end of the day.
Which leads us to what floored me. Indigenous navies. We're talking the Spanish, known for their naval power, relying on indigenous allies to combat these pirates.
And that reliance, driven by pure necessity, led to the creation of indigenous navies.
Yeah.
On a scale that is just mind-blowing. We are not talking about a few canoes here. These were massive fleets, possibly even bigger than what Spain had in the Atlantic at that time.
Hold on, we're talking fleets built and crewed by indigenous people, potentially outclassing European powers. That rewrites everything I thought I knew about this era.
It really challenges the traditional narrative about European exploration, doesn't it? This wasn't just their tech and ambition. Indigenous agency was key. And the book has these incredible examples, like the 1754 campaign, for instance.
Oh yeah, tell me about that one.
The Spanish essentially hired out these indigenous leaders in Iligan and Dapitan over in Mindanao. They ended up with a fleet of, get this, over 20 of these smaller, super fast maneuverable boats, plus 2 big galleons, all made by indigenous shipbuilders.
I'm picturing hundreds of these swift boats, expertly crafted, swarming towards some lumbering Spanish galleon. That's a naval battle I never imagined. How many people are we even talking crewing these ships?
Over 500 indigenous sailors and warriors.
500! And that's one campaign. Man, talk about overlooking a whole side of history because we're stuck on the European perspective.
It makes you wonder what else we're missing, right? And it wasn't just brute force either. Diplomacy was absolutely essential in making those alliances work.
Okay, so let's unpack this system of tribute that underpinned it all. Not as simple as, you fight for us, was it?
Not even close. Indigenous groups, they provided the men, the boats, even led campaigns, but it was strategic.
So what were they getting in return for putting their lives on the line like that?
Well, Spanish support, which was huge in that era, but also recognition of their own authority, exemptions from paying tribute later on. It's a give and take.
Yeah.
And this is where the book tells this incredible story about Sultan Azim ud-Din of Sulu. Talk about playing the game.
Oh, I'm here for this. What'd he do?
This guy understood that Spain was terrified of Islam spreading any further, so he used that.
No way. Like, setting them against the Moro pirates?
Even better. He basically says, help me get my throne back after this family drama, and I'll convert to Catholicism.
You're kidding. That's next level, like, keep your friends close. He played that perfectly.
He did, and it worked. Big public baptism, parades in Manila, the whole bit. Culture clash much.
Oh, I bet. But with all these shifting alliances, agendas, Couldn't have all been smooth sailing, right?
You said it. These alliances were forged under pressure, constantly tested. And the 1762 British invasion of Manila, whole other level of complicated.
Oh man, the Brits, assuming Filipinos would welcome them as liberators. What a miscalculation that turned out to be.
Right. And they faced fierce resistance. And not just from the Spanish. Indigenous communities fought back hard.
Which proves it wasn't blind loyalty to Spain, right? These communities wanted to maintain order, repel any threat, no matter where it came from.
And that's where the messiness of these alliances gets really interesting. You've got someone like Diego Salong, an indigenous leader. First, he sides with the Spanish against the Brits.
And then leads a rebellion against those same Spanish. It's like everyone's switching teams.
Exactly. Shows that even with a foreign invasion happening, indigenous leaders weren't just pawns in some bigger game. They had their own goals, and they were going for it. Salong is a perfect example of how fragile things were. He knew the Spanish had power, but the Brits show up. Opportunity.
Everyone's scrambling in that kind of chaos, and religion, man, it was woven into everything. We talked about how the Spanish were fixated on Islam, but it wasn't just them, was it? Catholicism itself became a huge factor.
You said it. A lot of indigenous groups, they saw fighting piracy alongside the Spanish almost as like a holy mission. Protecting their faith was a huge part of it.
Wow. The book actually describes priests right there on the front lines of these armies, blessing weapons, rallying the troops. That's intense.
It was. And it wasn't just the pro-Spanish side either. Even Salong's rebels, they used Catholic imagery, marching under banners of Christ.
So Catholicism could be a source of unity or division, depending who is using it.
Exactly. Both sides using the same symbols, the same rhetoric to justify their actions. Makes you think about how much of history comes down to how people interpret their faith.
It's wild, all these different cultures, beliefs colliding, but it wasn't all religion, right? There were some real-world rewards motivating people too.
Oh, absolutely. The Spanish were offering things, exemptions from tribute, positions in the government, even straight-up money.
It's easy to forget, with all the talk of conquest and resistance, that people still wanted the same things. Recognition, a leg up, or just plain old greed.
Human nature never changes, right? And let's not forget the spoils of war, right? Piracy meant plunder. Fighting it wasn't just about surviving, it could be pretty profitable.
A mix of zeal, ambition, fear, maybe even some opportunism fueling the whole thing.
You got it. And it wasn't all promises either. The book doesn't shy away from the dark side. Spanish wanted control, harsh punishments were part of it, whippings, jail, even executions.
No romanticized pirate adventure here. This was brutal.
It was. There's this one story, just heartbreaking, about these refugees during the British invasion, falsely accused of theft, tortured by the local officials.
Awful. Just goes to show you didn't have to be picking sides to get caught in the middle of it all.
The ones with no clear allegiance often suffered the most.
And it wasn't just the men out there fighting either. The book talks about the vital roles women played.
They kept everything going. Men are away. It's the women holding down families, communities, and supporting the war effort, whichever side they were on.
Couldn't escape the danger though, right? War doesn't discriminate.
Sadly not. Looting, raids. The book talks about women targeted, forced to flee their homes.
Important to remember their stories too. So often overlooked, but crucial to understanding what life was like back then.
Absolutely. Every voice matters. And speaking of a bigger picture, it's easy to think of all this happening in the Philippines as isolated. But it was all connected to what was happening globally. The British invasion, that was just one part of the 7 Years' War, right? World-changing stuff.
Like ripples across a pond. What happens in one place has consequences thousands of miles away.
Exactly. And the Spanish, they were always trying to one-up the British, the other European powers in the Pacific.
Which reminds me of that crazy story about them trying to get the Sultanate of Mysore in India on their side. Sounds insane, but in context.
Total sense. They needed allies, resources, anything to give them an advantage. Mysore, they had the military, the trade networks. Seemed like a good bet.
The world was more connected than we realized back then. Philippines, Europe, India, all tied together. Amazing.
It is. And those connections, they lasted. The effects of these alliances, the good and the bad, it all shaped the Philippines.
Speaking of, I was so interested by the book's look at the Chinese community in Manila. So important to the city, but they were always walking on eggshells, weren't they? Suspicion, discrimination.
The Chinese question, the book calls it. Were they loyal subjects helping the colony thrive, or a threat about to turn on them? The Spanish never quite decided.
And that's what's scary. That uncertainty led to horrible violence.
A very dark part of the story. The book doesn't hold back on describing the massacres, the targeting of the Chinese. Tough to read.
Shows how unstable that colonial system was. Fear and suspicion, even towards people who were vital to the colony, could turn deadly in a heartbeat. And even after they beat the British, it didn't get any better for the Chinese community, did it?
Nope. If anything, it came worse. Spanish were terrified of another uprising, rounding people up, shipping them off to other islands, some even sent back to China.
Brutal. So much for being integral to the colony, huh? Fear makes people do terrible things.
It does. Shows how easily it can be used, how it spirals out of control, even when it means hurting your own society in the process.
It's hard to wrap my head around, just how prejudice like that could lead to such drastic action. Kicking out the Chinese community, the violence, the suspicion. Man, talk about the human cost of these power struggles.
Yeah, it's rough. And it really highlights this point the book makes. The Spanish Pacific wasn't just some simple story of Europe coming in and taking over. This was dynamic, constantly changing, shaped by indigenous people, by all those moments of collaboration, resistance, negotiation, conflict, everything we've been talking about.
We're so used to history being told one way, right? Usually the winner's side. But this book, it's like, hold up, let's rewind and see it through the eyes of the indigenous people who are right there in the thick of it.
And that completely changes how we understand things, doesn't it? Right, think about it. Those massive indigenous navies, how strategically someone like Sultan Azim-ud-Din was playing the game, the tangle of alliances. It makes you question everything about power back then.
It really does. All those years of learning about the age of exploration, it was all about European accomplishments. This flips the script.
100%. Imagine if we learned about that Iligan-Dapitan fleet as kids. This force as strong as any in the world at that time. How different would our view of history be? Our whole understanding of power and influence.
We've been working with half the puzzle pieces, it seems like. This book starts to put it together.
Yeah.
And like any good history deep dive, it just raises more questions. Really.
It does. It ends on this really thought-provoking note. What happened after? How did all this get, the collaboration, the resistance, everything, how did it shape the Philippines long term?
That's what I keep coming back to. It's not like things just went back to normal and the British left. Those alliances, the betrayals, the cultural mixing, the violence, it had to have a lasting effect.
Exactly. How did the communities, the ones fighting for and against the Spanish, how'd they hold on to their own identities after? How did all that back and forth, the unity and the division, how did it lead to the Filipino nationalism we know today? So much to unpack there.
So much. So for everyone listening, if there's one thing to take away, it's that history is messy. There's always more to the story, more sides to see, connections you wouldn't expect. And it's those unexpected turns, those things that make you rethink what you thought you knew. That's where the real understanding is.
Perfectly said. Hopefully this deep dive has you curious, ready to dig a little deeper yourself, question what you've been told, and find your own aha moments along the way. After all, the best discoveries are the ones that surprise us.